Welcome to another video, and in this film we are going to be going over how to choose the two works of study of all the different literary texts that you probably studied at school so far, and also among the 4 questions that you will be getting for the real IB Paper 2 exam, which question should you actually choose that would fit best with your pre-prepared two works of study, okay? And so today in this video we'll be going over broadly 4 different things. First, we will go over the checklist for choosing text, and here we have the singular form and the plural form as well, because the first half of the checklist specifically applies to what are some things that you should be looking at when it comes to determining whether that one text, one novel, one poem, or one short story, or a collection of short story or poems would be the applicable choice for the paper 2, right? And then the second half of the checklist would specifically apply when looking at the combination of the 2 texts, right? Because paper 2 is all about comparing and contrasting. So in order to develop that mindset, right, we want to make sure that we are considering a couple of things. And then specifically when it comes to, okay, now that I chose 2, what next, right? I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a compare and contrast chart, which we also call a CC chart, and I'll help you figure out how to fill that out. And then the third thing we're going to be looking at is strategically approaching the prompt. So when it comes to looking at a prompt, what are the steps that we should be taking, okay? And last but not least, this is also a question that a lot of people ask me about. So then I get what the paper 2 is about, and how should I actually prepare when I'm being taught of this new literary work, or when I'm currently reading this novel, or like whatever work that you are studying at school, okay? And so I'll be going over some tips for note-taking and also how to just generally prepare for the paper 2. Okay, so the checklist for choosing text. Before we go over the specific checklist, okay, we have to remember that it's important for the paper 2 exam that you are able to remember key moments, okay? So if you forget going into the exam, like, what was the text about? What happened in the story? You can't use it for the paper 2, right? And that probably means that you have not studied. So a lot of people ask me, like, how do I actually prepare for the paper 2 when I don't have any idea what the questions are going to be, right? And all I know is, the 2 texts that I'm going to be using. Same thing with math and science, right? You guys memorize formulas. With English, you're memorizing the plot of the story and also literary techniques, author's intention. That's the memorizing part that you would have to do before you go into the exam. In order to score well, right, what are some things that we need to actually make sure we're doing in the essay itself? First, we have to make sure that we construct a well-supported argument. We call it an argument because we have prompts, right? With the prompt, that means we are always focusing on arguing for something, right? We are saying this is the idea that is suggested through the 2 works that we have studied, right? And so are we actually supporting that well? Are we also integrating meaningful comparisons, right? So are we talking about the similarities a lot? And there's an emphasis on comparison. By the way, that's not the same thing as contrast, because contrast is difference. Comparisons are similarities. So obviously there are 2 different texts, right? One is written by one author, the other is written by another author, which means their background is going to be different, which means the plot is going to be different, which means what happens and the intention might be slightly different, right? And so then despite those differences, are we actually talking about what is similar, right? That's really important. And then last but not least, flexibility, right? We have pre-memorized a lot of the stuff that's related to 2 individual texts, right? Then knowing what we already know, okay, without panicking and without misinterpreting the prompt, are we able to respond flexibly to the questions, right? So let's say we prepared our analysis for one text about specifically like oppression, power, right? That's like our main theme. But then all of a sudden, let's say the only question that really fits into your 2 works that you have prepared is asking about relationships, right? Then can you really fit that idea of power into relationships, right? If you're able to do so, then you'll be able to craft a good essay. How do we prepare for that? We can prepare by practicing with a bunch of different prompts before you go into the exam, okay? So practice is key. Okay, but before we practice, we need to figure out what 2 texts are we going to use, okay? And so for this, we have to make sure that we have not used this literary work for our IA. Okay, so if you already used this literary text for your IA, the one that is getting submitted to IB, right? You cannot use this for your final paper 2 exam. For summatives and formatives, it's okay because your teacher already knows, like, okay, this is just for practice, or like, we're only on this unit. There are no other options that you can use, so you can just use whatever you use for the IA. If that's the case, it's okay. But actually for the real final IB exam for the paper 2, you cannot use the same text that you use for your IA. If you are in HL, if you already use this text for the HL essay, you also cannot use this. So IB strictly prohibits the use of repeating the same text. Okay, so make sure you have that in mind, okay? And with the basis that it was not used yet for any, official exams, including the IA and HL essay, these are some of the things that you have to first consider, which is text engagement. Okay, and so this is really important. I feel like a lot of you are like, these texts, I was just forced to read at school, right? I didn't have a chance to pick the one that I like. I don't really like books anyway, so whatever, right? But still, of all the different texts that you've read, there must be at least 1 or 2 that was like relatively better to read, right? As in, maybe it was really easy to read. Maybe the theme was, something that you're kind of interested in. Maybe something about the author was really interesting. Maybe it's the author's background that you're like, wow, there's a lot of like relevance. There's a lot of things that I can connect with or I can understand, right? And so if that's the case, then that would also be part of text engagement. So a couple of questions, right? The first question is, did I actually read the book? This is really important, okay? Because a lot of people are like, I don't have time. I'm just gonna use SparkNotes. I'm just gonna lit chart this, okay? If it's a text that you're not going to use for the paper 2 and you already know that, then of course it's okay for you to not read it and just, know a good amount of what happens in the text and also authorial choices to do well on your summative or formatives. But still, if this is something that you're going to use for the real IB exam, of course you have to actually read the entire text. There may be some details that would be really good for you to mention in a paper 2 essay or just any kind of analysis for this particular text that might not be evident in SparkNotes or in lit charts, because SparkNote, lit charts, those websites already have shortened and summarized everything for you, right? So if I were to ask, okay, but exactly in between this and that scene, what happens? You'll be like, I'm not sure because I didn't read it. And so make sure you have read the entire text on your own. Let's say you did this already, okay? Then the next thing is, I read it, but do I actually understand the story, characters, and themes, okay? In the beginning, after you read it, you might be left with the feeling of, so what was the really message of this text? If that's the case, of course you can do research and I'll go over how to do that at the very last slide. But even until the moment you're about to take the paper 2, if you're like, I still need someone to explain to me, so basically what the theme is, right? That means you don't have any confidence with this text and there is no text engagement. So just because you read it doesn't mean you understood it, right? And so the next thing that we need to consider is understanding, okay? But let's say we do have an understanding. Then next, was this a text I enjoyed studying, making it easier for me to recall details and write an analysis on an unseen prompt? I think enjoyment is a really big thing that I constantly emphasize, okay? You might have a selection of 4 works that you can choose from and you're like, I understand all 4, okay? And if you're now at a stage where it's time to decide on the 2, then just ask yourself, okay, what did I actually enjoy reading, right? Of all the 4 texts, what do I actually want to use, okay? And so enjoyment is something that's important for you to consider. After that, we now want to consider authorial choices and intent, because this is the main part of our paper 2, okay? Without this, you will not be able to score well for a paper 2. So, number 1, can I explain why the author wrote this text and what central ideas or messages they wanted to convey? Why the author wrote this text. This is directly intention. So through this book, what did the author want to say or do, okay? If you can understand that, good, right? That means you have a good understanding of the text. Next, how do I understand the historical, culture, or social context that influence the author's perspective. This requires you to know context, which means you need to do research, okay? External research, okay? Why is this important? Because in order to understand why the author wrote this text, you probably want to know who the author is. In order to understand who the author is, you probably need to know historical, cultural, social influences, okay? And so make sure you're doing research on this. And then the third question is, am I able to discuss the author's choices that shape the reader's interpretation of the text? So author's choices. We talked about authorial choices in the earlier video, so if you have no idea what author's choices is referring to, make sure you watch that video and ask yourself, am I able to talk about these? Okay, if yes, check, okay? Next, can I analyze the text from multiple angles, such as character development, narrative structure, and other stylistic authorial choices? Okay. Multiple angles. This is also important because if you're able to look at this from multiple angles, that also naturally means that you'll be able to answer questions with flexibility, right? If you're able to look at this in this direction, considering this theme and this perspective, but let's say we get a question that asks you to consider another perspective, right? Or multiple perspectives, then you want to be able to provide that, right? And so it could be scenes like this. Even though maybe we're talking about the suffocation of the protagonist. They feel really, really frustrated. At the same time, what is that implying? We're also implying maybe the dangers of that kind of social environment because we're talking about how much it can ruin an individual, right? So looking at it from how does it emotionally or psychologically affect an individual is one angle. Looking at it from a perspective of broadly the bigger society, right? That's another angle to approach it. So that's what we mean by multiple angles. If you can do that, another check. Last but not least, do I have at least 3 to 5 significant quotes or moments I memorized that I can use to support my analysis? This memorization part only applies to test or exam settings, okay? After closing the book, right? After reading it once and you close the book, and I ask you to okay, recite some quotes for me, and you're like, oh, I'm not sure, which will probably be everyone, right? That doesn't mean you're not hitting the criteria or the checklist, because this will happen only when you start actually preparing for the paper 2, when you have the quotes memorized and prepared. And so this is kind of like a checklist that you would ask yourself after preparing all your notes, okay? Then, next, personal strengths. Have I written successful essays on this before? This is important. Successful. Not a question of, have you written essays on this before? Have you written successful essays? Why am I actually adding the word successful? Because maybe you thought you had a good interpretation of the text and you have a lot of good ideas. But for some reason, every time you write a paper 2 at school using this text, your teacher is always like, wrong interpretation, question mark? What are you trying to say, right? That means you did not successfully write an essay using this prompt, right? And then for some reason, you switch it around, you write a paper 2 on a different text, and then your teacher's like, good, 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 and relatively the score is better. That means the essay that you scored worse on with the text that you originally wanted to use, that's really not the text that you want to be considering, okay? So that does not match your personal strength with writing. So ask yourself, have I written successful essays? The last criteria or the checklist that we need to think about is, does this text align with my strengths, making it easier to write a well-structured, insightful response? This strength could come from your preference for a particular text type, your preference for a particular genre, your preference for a theme, okay? So at school, you probably, read multiple text types. That could be a poem, that could be a play, that could be a graphic novel, right? This could be a short story, right? Let's say you're someone who's like, oh my gosh, graphic novels? Oops. Oh no. Graphic novels? No, right? If that's the case, then you don't want to pick this, because for the paper 2, you won't even have the text in front of you. So if it has to come from rote memorization, how would you be writing an essay that you don't even want to talk about, or you're not really good at talking about? So you don't want to use that. But let's say you're personally someone who's like, I love poems. I really like analyzing poems. I always scored a good, like grade. That's your strength, right? So you want to talk about a poem in your paper 2. So that's how you would kind of decide, what do I want to use? After you've picked that, right, now it's time to consider the combination. As a set, does it work well? So we have to consider its comparative potential. Even though we don't know what exact prompt we're going to get, regardless of the prompt that we're going to get, can we make comparison points, okay? So for our first question is, do the text share enough similarities to create meaningful connections? Can we talk about common themes, common character arcs, common stylistic choices, okay? So consider that. If that's a yes, move on. Are there clear contrasts that will allow for insightful analysis of differences? Usually this will be like a, of course, no duh. But still, you want to clearly think about this instead of being like, of course, it probably would have because they're 2 different texts. You want to be able to explain that to someone. If I were to ask you immediately on the spot, okay, so what are the differences? And you're just telling me like, well, I mean, it's different because it's written by 2 different authors, right? But we're talking about author's intention, not who the author is, right? And so you want to make sure you have clear authorial choices or, like components of the text that you can compare and contrast. This is about balance, which is going to be criteria C. Can I effectively compare the text without one overshadowing the other? Balance as in, are you able to talk this much for text A and this much for text B, right? If you're able to talk about this much for text A, but then relative to the amount that you can talk about or analyze, if you're only giving me this much for text B, that's also not a good balance, right? That will also affect your criteria A, which is understanding. Okay? If I'm the marker and I'm realizing that there's an imbalance of discussion, then I might ask myself, did this student actually understand text B, or are they just using it for the sake of using it, or using it without even understanding it fully, right? And so that will impact understanding. If understanding is impacted, most likely criteria B, analysis, right, and evaluation will be impacted. So it's kind of like a chain effect. So, make sure that you are making sure that there is a strong comparative potential. The next, coverage of prompts. This goes back to flexibility, okay? So number 1, do the text together cover a broad spectrum of possible prompt topics? We went over 3 broad topics for prompts, and so can we fit this into a prompt about theme? Can we fit this into a prompt about techniques? If you're someone who's interested in talking about context, can you actually fit this into a prompt about context, right? Does it actually do that? Maybe one has a big emphasis on context, and then the other has a super big emphasis on themes. If that's the case, you might not want to use it as a set, right? Can I use both texts to respond to different types of questions with depth and flexibility, okay? So let's say it kind of all fits here, but depth, super different. If you can talk about theme in like real deep depth, right? But then for a question about technique, it's not that deep, or there's not really much to say, and there's like an imbalance of the 2 texts, then it's probably not a good balance, right? So avoid using it. But let's say that also got a check mark, right? Then, do they allow for exploration of different perspectives or interpretations? Now, this is kind of more about author's intention. Okay, so we're talking about similar idea, theme, right? But maybe, right, the way the author was trying to allow us to interpret this theme was different. Text A did it in this way, text B did it in this way, right? So even though we're talking about, oh, similar theme, different perspectives, right? Can I pivot my argument if the prompt requires a different focus than expected? So this is like your flexibility, right? If I thought the question was all going to be about like setting, right, as an authorial choice, so this is a technique question, but then the question ended up asking me about minor characters. Can I still talk about it? or have I not prepared anything for minor characters, right? Honestly, though, with coverage of different prompts, I will say this. Once you choose a paper, like a two text, right? Two texts that have some kind of comparative potential, you don't really have to consider so much about its coverage of prompts. This is more minor. The reason why I have included this in here, though, is just to make sure that you're practicing with a lot of different prompts, because we cannot predict what prompts are going to be out for the next exam. There's no way of predicting. There is no pattern, okay? The only thing that we know is that there are 3 different types of prompts, okay? But sometimes, you know, in the recent exam, there was a question specifically about the presentation of poverty. But then in another year, there was a question about happiness. In another year, there was a question about relationships, okay? And so there's really like the range is so wide. Therefore, you want to make sure that you're practicing with a bunch of different prompts so that no matter what prompt you get, you're like, oh, okay, I can kind of recycle the ideas that I use for the practice, okay? So that's the whole point of this.